For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. Terry Shakinovsky discusses a book titled The Knock on the Door, the story of the Detainees Parents Support Committee. Briefly tell us how the idea of this fascinating book started.
Well, the book was commissioned, the idea for the book came out of some of the founders of the DPSC, Daphne Mashila Nkosi, as she is now, and Max and Audrey Coleman. They wanted the story to be told because they believed it had relevance for South Africa today, and it was sponsored, in fact, by Daphne Mashila Nkosi and by the Kalahari Foundation, which is part of the mine that she heads up.
Terry, the book comes after South Africans recently learned about what really happened to anti-apartheid campaigner Mohamed Timur in 1971. Can you just remind us how detention without trial functioned during the apartheid era and the dangers it posed?
The book touches on it briefly because, of course, detention without trial has a long history in South Africa, a long history. But really, we look at the history of John Vorster Square and what happened around that. And Ahmed Timur was one of the first people to die at John Vorster Square. There were many, but there was a series of legislative measures passed, each time tightening the noose, as it were, making it harder and harder, denying more and more freedoms and extending the period for which people could be held, it went from 30 days to 90 days, and then denying even those limited rights that they did have within the jails. So the book does cover it, but it's quite painful to watch it being extended, that network of security legislation being extended.
Tell us about the Detainees Parents Support Committee, because we know it played a very prominent role in the 1980s in supporting detainees and as well as their families.
So this was born, the Detainees Parents Support Committee, or DPSC as they were called for short, it came into being when there was a big swoop in 1981. It was the start, really, of a new non-racial anti-apartheid movement emerging again in the 80s after the terrible repression of the 70s in the wake of the Soweto uprising and all that happened then. And the security police swooped on a number of people, and the families of those that were detained, the families and the parents got together, also the comrades. So, it wasn't only the parents. A lot of the people detained, their comrades realized how hard it would be for the parents and tried to mobilize and organize the parents around that. And Audrey Coleman, her son Keith, was one of those picked up, describes how they decided to call themselves after the mothers of Argentina whose children had been disappeared and who demonstrated again and again, in the central square. They decided to name themselves after, they had that organization in mind, and that name was an inspiration for them, and that's why they called themselves the Detainees Parents Support Committee. They were emphasizing that, these were parents that were involved.
Despite serious restrictions and threats, we know that newspapers like The Star will from time and again publish news about the DPSC's work as well as feed into the international media. How has this helped during the period?
It was really, for me, one of the strongest things that came out of the book. What you realize when you're writing about detainees held in the most awful conditions, subject to terrible torture, or else simply to the torture of solitary confinement, which in itself is one of the worst tortures that can be inflicted, but without really, almost powerless, no access to the courts. And you realize how important the role of both the media and the courts were, even in that situation, and that in truth, without the media, this would have been a very, very different picture. You realize how again and again the media was a lifeline because it was able to publicize what was going on. And the fact that it was a relatively free media, and of course I say relatively because the press was subject to very harsh restrictions about what they could say and what they couldn't say, but they worked around it all the time. They used, to the extent that there was a gap for them to exploit, they certainly exploited it, and they were able to again and again publicize what the DPSC was doing, and that was very, very, very important in keeping South Africa's eyes, but also the world's eyes on what was happening inside South Africa's detention cells. Without the media and then without the courts, it would have been a very, very different picture. And it's such a reminder to us of no matter what is happening in our country, how reliant we are on those central pillars of a free press and an independent judiciary. And the founders, the DPSC organisers, talk about how everything they did, they had a two-part strategy. If they were approaching the government, if they were taking a delegation to the Minister of Police to plead for detainees' rights, they also ensured that they had publicity for it. And without that publicity, nothing would have happened. And in fact, the international publicity that the DPSC was able to get for what was going on in South Africa, in particular for the imprisonment of children, which so shocked the world. You know, as they say, Audrey Coleman and others, for anybody to be detained is a terrible violation of rights. But we understood that if we could expose the detention of children, it would shock the world in a way that even the detention of adults wouldn't. And indeed, that's what happened. And that disgust, that international revulsion and disgust at what the South African, at what the apartheid regime was doing, was played into the anti-apartheid movement and the pressure that was brought to bear on the South African government.
This book also draws us to the wonderful work that was done by many people, including businessman Max Coleman and his wife Audrey. Can you also briefly highlight the specific work of the Coleman family and others for the DPSC?
So their son Keith was detained in 1981, as I say, and they were one of the founding members that came together to say, what can we do to help our children? It wasn't only children, our sisters, our spouses. As you see from the cover, you know, Tom Mashinini was there because his wife Emma had been detained. So the Colemans were one of those founding members, and they then sustained their involvement. It's quite an extraordinary tale in a way, because Max was a very successful businessman, but he never went back to being a businessman. He became, in effect, an activist. But what they say, the Colemans, is that they were given the prominence that they were, and they assumed the role that they did only because they were given the space by a very, very racist regime. And so because they were white parents, the apartheid government was much less quick to clamp down on them. There had been other attempts made. For example, Winnie Mandela tried in the wake of the Soweto uprising to start a Black Parents Association in Soweto, and the repression was swift and brutal. These parents were given a little bit more space because it was such a racist regime, and they were very aware of that. And I think the triumph of the organisation was that they were able to use that space afforded a very privileged racial group to extend that to fighting for others, to use that space to win privilege and some limited protection for detainees of all races.
Please tell us about more of your involvement in the DPSC and about some of the people involved who continue to be prominent in our country.
Well, it's quite extraordinary because there are very, very few significant people, you know, from the struggle, people who are prominent now, that the DPSC wasn't involved with because the repression was so widespread. So almost everybody was either detained, or their comrades were detained, or their families were detained, and so they were interacting with the DPSC to help find out where they were. But one does recognise the names. It's one of the things that the journalists have commented on as we've been doing interviews for the book. One journalist said, you know, it was interesting to meet the young version of Barbara Creasy, Barbara Hogan, but you read all about that. And for example, you know, what Nomvula Makonya was subject to, how, you know, what she endured in the police cells, and of course Connie Seope Sengwe, many of the leaders and the icons of our struggle today, their stories are told in the book.
Can you also tell us about the formation of the National Medical and Dental Association, which was also aimed at challenging how doctors treated the detainees?
Very much so, and the DPSC worked very closely with NAMDA, as they called themselves, the National Mental and Medical Association, and they were formed, you know, in the wake of the disgrace that was the South African medical establishment's reaction to the death of Steve Biko, and because there had been doctors involved who had not protected Steve Biko, who had stood up for the state, who had allowed this, you know, the brutal torture that killed him to go ahead. And so in part, NAMDA was formed in reaction to that. They were looking for a progressive role for doctors to play, to support the struggle and to fulfill what they believed were the ethics of being a doctor, which was to heal and to care. And so that was one thing that was important. The other thing was important was, again, that NAMDA was formed across racial lines. They were drawing in doctors and medical practitioners of all races across South Africa. And they sought to see what they could do. And it was very, very important. They did offer medical care for the detainees that came out, often terribly brutalized. And it was, in a way, one of the interviewees in the book Michael Rice says, you know, in a way we were a laboratory for what's come to be understood about post-traumatic stress disorder. Nobody understood really, we didn't have enough information yet to understand what detention was doing to people and how the post-traumatic stress order that they were suffering from would play out in the months and years to come. And so NAMDA was able to offer care. NAMDA and the other organization they worked with, OASA, which was made up of psychologists and social workers. Together they provided mental and psychological care for the detainees and developed a protocol. And you'll hear Paul Verheyen saying in the book how important it was, because often the detainees coming out, their last memory of touch was a horrific one, was of torture. And it was so important that they were touched carefully and respectfully with people who had an understanding of the ordeal that they had been subject to. And often that first medical examination was the start of a healing process, and it was very important it was carried out correctly. And it's very, very moving to hear about the members from OASA, Terry Sacker, talking about the fact that a pattern began to emerge in the interviews they were doing. Often the detainees, especially the children, would say, my mother or my grandmother died while I was in detention, and she realized that these women were dying of broken hearts. And when you think what it means, the panic that a parent feels in a shopping center if they can't see their child for 1 minute, how terrifying that is. If you imagine what it is to have your child held, you don't know where, by people that wish them possibly the worst possible evil, and you have no control, no knowledge. So it's important that as a nation we remember the trauma, not just those who were inside the jail suffered, but those who were outside too. And I think that trauma has a lot to do with our nation today. You know, it's important that we remember it.
And lastly, Archbishop Desmond Tutu also says the DPSC laid the foundation for the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Can you tell us about this aspect?
You know, I think that speaks to the meticulous records that the DPSC kept, and it was really such an achievement that the apartheid government was never able to discredit them, because they sought very hard to say this is propaganda, these are made up stories, they're just trying. So they looked for any loophole they could find, and because a lot of the people testifying had come out of detention and were often suffering from the mental confusion that results from solitary confinement or from torture, and because a lot of them were testifying in a language that wasn't their mother tongue, or sometimes were only semi-literate, and so their written affidavits were not necessarily, you know, as watertight as they could be. There was a lot of room for the apartheid government to pick at the details and to say, oh no, it wasn't the 10th of February, it was the 11th of February, and therefore this is all lies. But the DPSC was so careful and so meticulous, they did not put out a single statement that couldn't be absolutely substantiated. And so try as the apartheid government did, and as I say, they certainly did, they could never pick holes in what was, and that proved very important for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because there were meticulous records kept of the systematic torture that had gone on, and many of the DPSC workers, including the Colemans and others, testified about the torture that they had seen and witnessed, and that was an important part of the TRC, as you say.
That was Terry Shakinovsky speaking to Crima Media's Polity about a book titled The Knock on the Door, the story of the Detainees Parents Support Committee.